With the cooler weather of autumn, I thought it would be the perfect time to share some of my favorite sourdough creations with you. I'm so excited to share with you 3 different sourdough breads and a comforting sourdough dish, all inspired by the fall season. You might like to make yourself a warm cup of tea, find a comfortable spot, and follow along my fall sourdough baking. Here I have my sourdough starter. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in this video, and also this device that I'm using, but it's really nice and active. It has big bubbles, it's very light, and I'm making my first bread here, which is a sourdough olive oil bread. I'm adding flour to my bowl, and I like to measure it in a separate bowl because the bowl of my stand mixer is too heavy for my scale actually. So I'm measuring it in a separate bowl. Now I'm going to get out my stand mixer bowl. Of course, you can always make this bread by hand, as people have done for centuries, if not millennia, but I like some modern conveniences of mixing. So I'm adding my flour to the big bowl, and the recipe is in the description box for you to download. And then my favorite olive oil by a local olive oil ranch. I'll leave a link below, and you can also get a 10% coupon with my code that's in the description box. And some salt. I always like to use a really good sea salt, and yes, it would be better to measure it slowly instead of having a big clump come out. And here's my sourdough starter that I'm adding into the bowl with the oil, and what that does is also it makes it easier to remove it from this smaller bowl, because the oil kind of coats the bowl a little bit, and then everything else comes out a little bit easier. I'm a pretty neat cook. I like to make my cooking and baking pretty efficient whenever I can. Now I'm adding that to the flour in my stand mixer bowl, and now measuring out my water. Warm water is always really good for sourdough starter because it gets it off to a good start. Adding that directly onto all the other ingredients. And then I'm going to put the stand mixer bowl back into my KitchenAid stand mixer and start mixing on a slow speed at first, and then a higher speed. And as you can see, this is a really wet, shaggy dough. It's a high hydration dough, and it's very sticky. So sometimes it takes a little bit of trust that it will work out. I'm gonna let that sit for some time to just relax, and then I'm wetting my hands, scraping the dough a little bit off the sides because there's a lot that got stuck to the sides. And then I'm gonna do my first set of stretching, and I'm just folding it over back to itself, and wet my hands again because it is still really sticky and lifts the bowl actually as I'm doing this. And now it's coming together already. You can see that here. Put the wet towel back on, keep it from drying out, and let that sit for another half hour or so. The dough is looking pretty good, and again, wet hands. Do a second set of stretch and folds. Usually I do 3 at least. You can see how it's coming together. And now the dough is really forming a uniform loaf, or uniform dough, not a loaf. I'm not even baking it yet. So that's what I'm looking for. And put the towel back on. And sometimes you find little specks of dough on the towel. So now I'm ready to pre-shape the dough. I'm putting a lot of flour on my kitchen counter because it is still a pretty wet dough, and it's going to stick unless I flour my work surface. I need a dough scraper, and I love that I have everything just right there underneath me in a kitchen drawer, getting the dough off the sides of the bowl, and I'm going to transfer it right onto my work surface. As you can see, it's still pretty sticky, and that's okay because it is a something like a 70% hydration dough. I'll make sure to have some flour on my hands as I'm going to do some very gentle stretching and folding it back over itself. And somebody said the way to do this is to kind of touch the dough as if it's hot, because you only want to touch it very briefly, otherwise it will still stick to your fingers. And it's getting a little bit more balled up and less stretchy. A few more rounds here. And then I'm flipping it over, and now I'm creating a surface tension. I need to flour my hands, and as I'm pulling the dough towards me, I am pushing it underneath, and there's a big bubble. And I do that slight turns, pushing it towards me over the counter and creating this really tense surface on the outside. I have a round dough now, and I have my proofing basket. I like to add some rice flour to the bottom because that absorbs the water much less than regular wheat flour. And then I'm adding some wheat flour on top of it, and put my dough ball right into my proofing basket. They're also called bannetons. And there is the seam side up, and I like to close the seam just a little bit, just so it doesn't have this big open surface. And then I have a beeswax wrap and a fabric bowl cover on top to really keep it from drying out. I need to make sure it fits over it, but it does stretch. It doesn't look like it first, but it will go over my proofing basket. And there we go. And then I'll put that in the refrigerator for at least 10 hours, but actually this bread stayed in there for almost 2 days. On baking day, I remove my cast iron Dutch ovens from my cast iron wall rack that my husband built for me, and preheat the Dutch oven at 450 degrees for at least half an hour. Towards the end, I remove the dough from the refrigerator, and when the Dutch oven is piping hot, it needs to be really hot. I had to get an older footage here because my camera failed, how I dump the dough into the bottom of the Dutch oven and how I score it. I did it a little bit differently for this dough, but you get the idea. So you dump it in there, make sure you hit the middle, and then score it, put the lid back on. Actually, it's inverted, but sometimes I like to do it this way. And then I bake it for about 25 to 30 minutes with the lid on. And this is my little cleanup hack here. I use my bench scraper, I guess it's called that for a reason, to clean my work surface and just scrape all the dough bits and extra flour into a trash can. And when the first 25 minutes are over, let's see what it looks like. Oh, it's always something to do this on camera because you never know what it's gonna look like. Anyways, it's looking good. It goes back in the oven. Just as a side note, this was a really wet, rainy, humid day for California. So the dough came out a little bit differently because it does react to the environment. I'm gonna let it cool on a cooling rack before I cut it. It's about 2 hours later, and I'm going to show you the inside of this bread. There you go. You have some bigger holes and some smaller holes, but it's a nice soft crumb. And there's nothing better than a fresh slice of bread with some freshly made, homemade butter from our raw milk. And then just a little bit of salt on top. Just a sprinkle. And this is our new favorite bread. It is so soft and has such a mellow, great flavor. Yum, yum. And anybody baking with sourdough may know that sourdough can be super sticky. So now I need to clean my sourdough bits from the sink. First, I use some Bonami powder And then I have a copper scratch pad, if you will, which is actually really soft when it's wet. And then I scrape all the sourdough bits off the sink. For my next starter, I'm milling rye flour directly into my sourdough jar. It's very efficient. And use a little fork to stir it up. Sourdough likes oxygen, so it's always good to mix it. And I had some water in there already. Put the lid on, and here's my Sour House Goldie, which is a little bit too gadgety for me sometimes, but it actually works fantastic. So for my next bread, I have einkorn, spelt, and rye berries that I am milling fresh the morning that I'm making my family heirloom sourdough bread recipe. And there's nothing better than fresh milled flour for sourdough baking. And here's my sourdough starter. Adding a little bit of salt before I continue. Salt will also curb the activity and the sourness of the sourdough. And adding some water. I'm never measuring. I'm the queen of eyeballing. And here's my super active sourdough starter. Dump it all in there. I do have a recipe, but I just kind of mix it by feel. And there's going to be a really soft dough. This is the recipe that I grew up on, that my mom has always been making, my grandmother has been making, and I don't know how many generations it goes back to. For extra crunch, I like to add some unmilled grains. And after about 4 hours or so, the dough is a lot stiffer because, whoops, I thought that was a good moment. Spoon broke right on camera. Anyways, the whole grains soak up so much more water, and sometimes I need to add more water later. And because it's fall, I like to add pumpkin seeds and sunflower seeds. You can always add some nuts or other seeds as you like. But again, for the fall, I like the pumpkin seeds and the sunflower seeds. I have a floured loaf pan here and transfer the dough right in there. It's actually greased and floured. And I'm evening out the top of the bread here. I'll cover it with a beeswax wrap and let it sit in a warm spot. Now, this spot was really warm, and as you can see, the dough got stuck to the beeswax wrap, which is okay. I can rinse that off or scrape it off with a knife. Sometimes I actually put a piece of parchment paper on top of the loaf to keep that from happening. So I'll bake that for an hour and a half, and this is the next morning. It looks fantastic. And I actually let it cool overnight, so it's not warm, but it's fantastic. It came out just the way I wanted. It's a dense German style whole grain bread, and here it is. I could not be happier with this bread. More sourdough starter making. I milled some more flour and adding water to it. Stir it. As we know, sourdough likes oxygen, and I put it on my Sour House Goldie with a lid here. Keeps it at the optimal temperature. And look at what happened in the afternoon. It actually crawled out of the jar and onto my Sour House Goldie. I'm gonna have to clean that up, but it is so active, nice, bubbly, and very nice, just the way I want my sourdough starter to be. And I shared this in a recent video. Whenever I have some veggies that don't really fit together, I put them all in a skillet, and then I make a sourdough topping with sourdough, olive oil. I crack some eggs in there to give it a little bit more body and taste and just cohesiveness. Then I add my flour And again, there are recipes for this, but I kind of go by feel here. And some baking powder, because this is not a fermented sourdough. It's basically just thrown together. It's perfect also for sourdough discard if that is what you're doing, if you're discarding and feeding. And I'll mix that up. And pour it right over my sauteed veggies. It's kind of like a crust, but inverted. The crust is on top and the veggies are on the bottom. I had grated some Parmesan cheese and that goes on top, and then I bake that until golden brown. That was our dinner for that night. Now here's another bread that's more of a whole grain bread, but 50% whole grain. And I just absolutely love baking sourdough in my Dutch oven because it traps the steam and gives it a really good rise. And it's always so something to handle a very hot cast iron Dutch oven. Let's see if I can get it in there. Oop, there we go. It went right in there. And I've burned myself so many times. I actually have some burn gel in my kitchen for that occasion, even though you try to be as careful as you can. And I'm gonna give it a different score this time across in the middle. It's heavily floured, so it will create a little bit of a more visible pattern. The lid goes back onto the Dutch oven. And this one is a little bit bigger loaf, so I'll bake it for at least half an hour. The other one, the smaller olive oil sourdough loaf, I baked for about 25 minutes. And here's always my favorite moment, to see what it looks like when you pull it out, because you can't see it with a lid on. Let's have a look. Ooh, nice. And you can see all that steam there. Oh, very nice. So that goes back into the oven for another about 30 minutes. Until very nice and crusty on top. That's a much more rustic piece of bread right there. And often, because this is a bigger one, what I like to do is cut it in half while it's warm, so it's cooled off maybe an hour or so, because sometimes we don't go through all of it fast enough. And here's the crumb, really nice and even. I put the one half in a plastic bag, like I said, while it's still a little bit warm. Make it nice and tight and put it in our freezer. And then I thought, when we need it, not enough space in there, I guess. If you enjoy this video, I'd love it if you hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much for joining me here in my kitchen, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.